Bienvenue à la 4e réunion du comité permanent des
Welcome to the 4th meeting of the Standing Committee on Indigenous Affairs.
Economic Development. After today's two panels, we will also consider our work plan, which was distributed yesterday. On the first panel, we have Mr. Stephen Morse, Métis National Council. Hopefully, Regional Chief Terry TG from the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations will join us. On the second panel, we will have Tabitha Bull of the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business and Shannon Mitata Wabin of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. Je n'ai pas besoin de vous parler des mesures sanitaires, vous les connaissez tous.
You're all aware of the health regulations, and you all know about the protocols we follow in these meetings.
Each organization is invited to speak for 5 minutes, and that will be followed by a period of questions. In the first round of questions, we'll allow members 6 minutes each. And you're familiar with the timing with respect to a second round or any subsequent rounds. If time expires during the round of questioning, we will complete the order. So if Mr. Morse is now ready, I would invite Mr. Stephen Morse of the Métis National Council to speak to us. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Morse, after which we'll have questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. First thing I'd like to do is extend the regrets of President Caron, who was unable to attend today, and she's asked me to present in her stead. On the barriers for Indigenous economic development, I thought I'd start by looking at what the sources are of the barriers that we face. And I'd like to make a broad distinction between business development, which is faced by citizens and collectively held corporations, and economic development, which is faced by institutions and which will at the end of support business development. So the fundamental, with respect to business development, the source of the barriers are the socioeconomic circumstances of the Métis people. If you look,
I'm sorry, Mr. Morse, we've got a point of order from the floor. Oui, Monsieur Garon?
Oui, l'interprétation est dysfonctionnelle.
The interpretation isn't working.
So, Mr. Morse, just for your information, the translation is not happening in the committee room. They're trying to fix that.
Merci.
Mr. Morse, could you raise your mic a little bit closer to your mouth, please? Thank you so much. It helps the interpreters have a clear connection.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I think we're ready to try again.
Okay, Mr. Morse, we'll try to continue. If you would proceed, please.
Okay, thanks. I'll start from the top. First, I wanted to extend the regrets of President Caron, who was unable to attend, and she's asked me to present for the Métis National Council. In looking at the source of barriers to Indigenous economic development, I'm going to make a broad distinction between
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Chair, once again. Could you please ask the witness to raise his microphone so that it's directly in front of his mouth? Because I understand from tech services that there's a lot of popping.
Yes, Mr. Morse, sorry, this is, if you could bring the microphone closer to your mouth, it's popping at the moment, and that makes it hard for the interpreters.
Okay.
Level.
Is that better?
Yeah, and speak perhaps a little louder.
Okay, if that is now okay, I'll continue on. So I was like to make a broad distinction between economic development and business development. Business development is faced by citizens and collectively held corporations, while economic development is largely faced by institutions which fundamentally support business development. Looking at the sources of the barriers the source of, or the barriers for business development are fundamentally the socioeconomic circumstances of Métis people. And if you look at the available data, you see commonalities for Métis, Inuit, and First Nations when they're compared to non-Indigenous Canadians. You see lower income and wealth, lower housing value, worse household repair, lower formal education rates, lower labor force participation, employment rates, and self-employment rates. However, there are noticeable differences between the groups. And here we would
En
caution
français, ça
that
fonctionne toujours pas.
here we would caution that the statistics are potentially misleading for Métis. Since 2005, as an example, the rate of increase in Métis median income reported by StatsCan is significantly higher than that for the non-Indigenous First Nations or Inuit populations. Concurrently, the Métis population reported by StatsCan has increased at a greater rate than that of First Nations, Inuit, or the non-Indigenous population, and far beyond what could be accounted for by natural growth. So the increase in Métis income is largely driven by the increase in self-identification reported by Statistics Canada, when a large proportion of the population that was previously recorded as non-Indigenous.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt again. We need to suspend because the interpretation can't seem to hear the witness.
Understand. I'm sorry, Mr. Morse. We're experiencing difficulty with perhaps your headset may be at the root of it, but it does sound like there's a sort of a weakness in the sound coming from you. So we're going to have to suspend just for a second. Morris, I'm going to ask you to wrap up because we've gone over our time. Sorry.
Okay. So if we look at what are the remedies that the Métis National Council could be done, in terms of business development, it would be commit to the reestablishment of the Métis Economic Development Strategy through the capitalization of the MCCs rather than a push to borrow. The Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program growth supports demonstrated demand, access to the Canada Small Business Financing Program, and support in establishing regulated commercial sector Métis institutions. Importantly, equitable access to current economic development programming. First Nations and Inuit have access to the Lands and Economic Development Services Program, Métis do not, and to regional development agencies. And lastly, co-develop programming to address the gaps. There is no First Nations Finance Authority equivalent for Métis. That should be co-designed. Co-design programming in clean growth, infrastructure, access to CMHC insurance, and on procurement modernization, the funding of Métis business registries, and a commitment to develop meaningful statistics to guide our joint efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. I understand that Chief TG is here. If you are ready, Chief, you have 5 minutes at the microphone.
Thank you, Denisa, Sekuza, Skyza. Just want to acknowledge the territory I'm calling from, the unceded, unsurrendered, continually occupied territory, the Lheidli T'enneh, the Dakish people. Appreciate the opportunity to speak here today on behalf of the Assembly First Nations. I do hold the economic development portfolio on behalf of the Assembly First Nations and continue to work on our behalf of many First Nations across this country. Seeing that we're so diverse and have numerous communities, well over 630, there certainly is different points of views in terms of economic development, where many First Nations communities rely on not only our traditional economies, but our market-based economies, which we have been accustomed to since colonizations began. But certainly there are many issues in terms of environmental issues that we deal with as First Nations, and upholding our rights, treaty rights, and our different ways of knowing and being. Yet the common theme that serves as a barrier to First Nations economic development is the ongoing systemic impacts of colonialism, in particular the persistent failure to recognize and implement First Nations rights, treaty rights, and the ongoing denial of First Nations self-determination and jurisdiction. Now, it's really important to understand that UNDRIP is law as of June 21st, and certainly the declaration identifies and sees sovereignty and self-determination as a cornerstone for implementing First Nations rights, title, and interests. Most important is Assembly First Nations to ensure and address these barriers as First Nations. What we need are solutions which address barriers to all First Nations. In some cases, those barriers relate to failure to implement the treaty relationship for specific modern treaty obligations and historical treaties. In other cases, those barriers relate to specific impediments found in the Indian Act itself or related to policies federally, provincially, or even corporate Canada. Barriers include lack of respect for First Nations rights, jurisdictions as it relates to treaties and our inherent rights, lack of involvement in economic development planning decisions and financing. Certainly, the lack of respect for First Nations rights and jurisdictions, as we've seen in many historical fights, whether it's on the territory or in the public or in the courts, our First Nations continue to be in the court systems to fight for what is rightfully ours. Perfect case is the Huset case here in British Columbia, fighting for the ability to commercially fish some of the commercially viable species. Lack of involvement in planning First Nations must be included. Strategic planning, decision-making process for economic recovery and long-term as we come out of the pandemic. Certainly that is some of the discussions that we have been having, not only nationally, but also provincially as we come out of this pandemic, building back better, if you will. We need to be part of those discussions. One of the core standards recognized by UNDRIP, which is law here in British Columbia, but elsewhere in this country now, it is federal law, as in Bill C-15, certainly need to uphold and live up to many of the articles within UNDRIP, including free, prior, and informed consent. The way we see it, it would provide more certainty in terms of how decisions are made. So finance as well. Finance is always an issue in regards to funding certain projects that are led by First Nations or in partnership with First Nations. It's very difficult to access financing in terms of getting the necessary finance on many projects perhaps out there in terms of whether it's infrastructure and or development of projects that are important to the not only our First Nations communities, but to the economy in general. Going forward, I'd like to see more working together in terms of joint actions, measures to progress these areas. Certainly, it's I know this is a very short time, 5 minutes, doesn't allow me to say a hell of a lot, but certainly there are major issues that we're seeing in Ottawa. The political discourse that we're seeing, certainly many racialized peoples, including Indigenous peoples, concerned about the state of this country. So certainly we need to do this in partnership. Thank you, Mwasicho.
Thank you very much, Chief TG. We're now going to proceed to the first round of questions. If you have a headset, Chief, if you could put it on, it helps with the translation. We're going to go to the first round, and we'll begin with Mr. Shields from the Conservative Party. Mr. Shields, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the witnesses being here today. So, Chief Terry, you covered a lot of ground in only 5 minutes, which is great. So when you talk about barriers and you identified under the Indian Act, is there anything specific under the Indian Act that you would identify as a barrier? Yellow.
I'm hoping he hasn't left the room to get a headset.
Sorry, I was trying to find a headset here. Can you repeat that question?
Sure. You covered a lot of things, but you said one of the barriers was under the Indian Act, that there's things there. Can you identify anything specific under the Indian Act that needs to be changed?
Well, in general, the Indian Act certainly, historically has had provide barriers for many First Nations in terms of accessing the proper, really ability to break away from some of these issues. The Indian Act, in terms of relation to First Nations, is far too often much of what has come out of Indian Act is through Indigenous Services Canada and also CERNA, where there is a lot of program funding. Now, as it relates to in terms of economic development, what we need to see is more investment, more infrastructure in terms of INAC funding. And we are seeing it somewhat. For example, the Police Act in terms of policing within First Nations is going from program funding to more substantial funding of more predictable funding is a really important step that provide, and we can learn from that. I think more predictable funding. Program funding doesn't work.
Right.
We need more funding in terms of economic development.
So shifting it from program funding to what you would call base funding, so it's guaranteed base funding, so it isn't something you're applying for and new programs are coming. You're looking for that base funding to be there solid over time rather than program funding.
Exactly. In terms of going from police services, once again, from program funding to essential services funding. But more importantly, in terms of economic development, more often than not, we're looking at different types of partnerships that will allow us to really create those spaces for, and this is investment into First Nations communities as it relates to economic development, is, those ties to INAC and CERNA, far too often are too stringent, in terms of what you can do with some of the funds versus what is necessary to initiate perhaps a project or anything like that. It's too much, and the Indian Act itself is too much paternalistic. let's just keep it at that, and
Well-
we need to break those ties.
Well, you know, with programs, you apply with certain guidelines, and then you have the restrictions to follow up. When you go to base funding, then like police, which I understand, get it out of a program and get it to base funding so it becomes permanent. So in the sense of economic development that you're directly involved in, the Alberta government signed a deal with an Indigenous group to work on a project here yesterday to do with carbon sequestration. You talked about partnerships. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about you need to move to?
Yeah, certainly. So some sort of whatever is necessary for First Nations to take over. And that sounds like a good partnership, whether it's with the province or the federal government. I think those types, we have some examples here in British Columbia, but I think overall, moving towards, and that sounds like a good initiative going to more green energy, perhaps, or an alternative energy and looking at carbon sequestration. We're ground zero for these past 8 months for climate change issues in British Columbia.
So the other thing you talked about was in the sense that the involvement in economic decision making that you're looking for, that's a barrier, that you believe you don't have input in decisions or cooperations with decisions now in the sense of funding for economic development. I assume because of your title and role, you're very familiar with this piece.
Yeah, I think, federally and provincially, they use the general idea is used these previous formulas, if you will. For example, there is an allocation for distribution of funds for, things like coming out of COVID. And they would allocate a certain amount because, you are 2% of the population, and we'll give you 2% of the funding. That doesn't work because, quite simply, we have 204 First Nations communities here in British Columbia, which require much more investment and funds to deal with the issues of COVID or even coming out of COVID. And so those formulas don't work. So that treatment and that look at in terms of engaging with First Nations needs to change.
Instead of looking...
You have about 30 seconds, Mr. Shields.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so what you're suggesting is the projects are much more important in the sense of recognition of what you can bring in a sense of projects rather than per capita funding.
Well, certainly per capita is necessary on some of these matters, such as, in COVID, the allocation similar to CERB for on-reserve funding. But I think overall, in terms of investment, it depends on the investment in the First Nations communities, especially if those regions, let's say the Northeast, if there is a project in regards to oil and gas, or in the South in regards to fisheries and the coastal areas, for First Nations that are leading on some of these very diverse projects that require much more investment, not just from our First Nations partners, but also from the province and the federal government.
Great,
We're going to have to wrap it up there.
Thank
you, Mr. Shields. Next is Mr. Pawlowski. You have 6 minutes.
Chief Teague, British Columbia's modern treaties, the Nisga'a Treaty, Tsawwassen Final Agreement, how important do you think they are in terms of advancing the economic development of those First Nation communities? And are they part of the answer across Canada in terms of bringing prosperity to other Indigenous communities?
As stated in the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements. So modern treaties, historical treaties, numbered treaties, the Douglas treaties out here, comprehensive reconciliation agreements, any number of agreements out here are very important because really what you're committing to is an arrangement. It's an agreement that must be upheld by all parties. In these modern treaties, far too often, and we've seen in the history of Canada how many treaties were broken. So quite simply, as the modern treaty, there is a number of them here in British Columbia need to be upheld. Those commitments made by provincial and federal government needs to be upheld and held at the higher standards because quite simply, those First Nations that do have modern treaties and Nisga'a treaties came into these agreements on the understanding that we were all going to work together, that the First Nations and even municipal governments were going to come together and work with the First Nations in how they were going to really administer some of their lands, decisions that are being made, and especially in terms of economic development, where there's many initiatives. Tsawwassen, you have a huge economic development initiative out there. The Nisga'a have their plans about development in terms of fisheries, as well as I believe they have arrangements with LNG. So those partnerships are quite important because quite simply, what they came into these agreements for is what I alluded to previously, is they don't want to be held by program funding. They want self-determination and sovereignty in how they conduct their own affairs and their traditional territories.
Thank you. Last week, Manny Jules from First Nations Tax Commission spoke to us, and one of his suggestions for economic development was to give First Nations and Indigenous people more ability to tax. Do you agree with that?
Certainly in terms of the way the sovereignty of those First Nations and in his community, the Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc, do have the ability to tax some of businesses that they have, in particular gas stations and those types of businesses. So it's really important to understand and know that if it's in their self-determination, their sovereignty to tax within their lands or their perhaps their administration within their First Nations community, I think it's their prerogative, and I think it really comes down to the First Nations' rightful place and the rights holders to administer what they deem necessary to be part of the economic fabric, if you will, of their respective territory. And in this case, we're talking about the municipality of Kamloops. The Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc do have the ability to tax and seen it in my receipts. So perhaps that is something that I do agree with in terms of how they deem necessary to really assert their own ability and the decisions that they make.
I guess I'll ask you the same question that I asked him last week. It seems to me, I'm from Thunder Bay, Rainy River, and I know in Thunder Bay, Fort William First Nations gets a fair amount of business from gas stations on the reserve. There must be 5 or 6 of them. Everyone in Thunder Bay goes over there to gas up. So there are some economic advantages for not having taxes and having lower tax rates there. Wouldn't you undermine the ability of some First Nations communities to economically prosper by changing the tax rules?
Well, I think the work that we do at the AFN is to support and advocate for self-determination, whether it's by arrangements made with the province or made with the provincial federal government. Really comes from the we don't impede in their way of how they move forward. It's up to them. It's their decisions. It's their sovereignty, self-determination. So I wouldn't impede in any way any First Nations community ability to make the decisions that they see fit for their community. So no.
30 seconds left, Mr. Belowski.
I guess a quick question, probably not a quick one, to Mr. Morris from Métis National Council. It seems to me that there is some benefit from the current tax situation the First Nation communities sometimes benefit from, but the Métis community doesn't. I know living in Norway House, the Métis community is right beside the First Nations community. Is that a big impediment or an advantage that the Indigenous community has that the Métis community doesn't have?
Very quickly, Mr. Morris.
Okay. wherever you've got a price differential, of course, there's a potential for economic leakage. But I do generally agree with the point that the negotiation of self-government, modern-day treaties, whether it's with the First Nations or with the Métis, is fundamentally good in providing certainty and allowing Métis and First Nations to make those trade-offs and make those decisions that are best for their communities.
Thank you, Mr. Morse. C'est maintenant le tour de Monsieur Garon. Monsieur Garon, vous avez 6 minutes.
It's now Mr. Garon's turn. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, and thank you, Grand Chief TG, to be here. It's a pleasure to have you here. In our present study, we're trying to get clear on the obstacles that might slow economic development, especially businesses in Indigenous communities. There is the yoke of the Act on Indigenous peoples. It seems that it limits Indigenous peoples' autonomy. Could you please identify in the Indian Act what are the principal constraints on your economic development? Would you like to direct the question to one of our witnesses? Yes, to Grand Chief TG, please.
Did you get that translation?
I got part of it.
Okay.
So I'll do my best. I'm regional chief, not a grand chief. To this end, I think it's really important as part of Section 35, the Indian Act, and also with the new Act, Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Bill C-15 that was passed federally. I think it's important, and just to share with some of the issues we have here in British Columbia. British Columbia, we're going over 2 years since the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was passed as law provincially in British Columbia. And as I stated in the legislature at that time when we passed the Act 2 years ago, was that DRIPA is really what my colleagues have stated is a human rights recognition. It's much more than just an act. It's really, it recognizes our human rights, our ability to sovereignty and self-determination. And what I stated there in terms of how it's relate to such initiatives or laws such as environmental assessment that is related to major projects and a big economic driver in this country. Much of Canada, British Columbia, is driven by natural resources, whether we like it or not. But there needs to be space. And this is related to free, prior, and informed consent. And I believe what you alluded to is the uncertainty of perhaps how decisions are made. The free, prior, and informed consent in our determination and First Nations perspective allows for more certainty. Really, if projects do come forward by major big companies that are proposing these major infrastructure projects, if you will, or anything of that nature, we need the space for all levels of government, including provincial, federal, and Indigenous governments to have that space together so that decisions can be made together. And if there is a blessing of going to go ahead, there's nothing more that is more really that gives certainty is if that all levels of government say yes or no to a project. So that's really important in terms of the new law that is the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Monsieur Garon, on ne vous entend pas.
Beaucoup. J'aurais une deuxième question. Je la dirigerai vers Monsieur Morse. La semaine dernière, les travaux du comité ont porté sur la loi sur la gestion financière des Premières Nations et il existe actuellement aucune loi de la sorte pour les...
sorry to interrupt, but the English is...
Sorry, the English is not coming through.
Not hearing the English from Monsieur Garon, the translation.
I'm getting the thumbs up now, Mr. Chair, so we can try to proceed.
Okay.
And
all right. On va résumer.
So, Mr. Garon, could you go on, please? Well, as I was saying, in our work last week, we dealt with the Financial Management Act. I'd like to ask Mr. Morse if something equivalent to this legislation would be helpful to his community. I'd like to hear what he has to say.
Thank you very much for the question. I think generally, as I was mentioning earlier, one of the issues that face Métis as opposed to First Nations and Inuit is the lack of institutions and the lack of access to current programming, not even future programming that the Métis face. We don't have an equivalent to the First Nations Financial Authority. I understand that FNFMB supports the work of the FNFA. And the FNFA, when you look at how it can assist economic development, one could look at the Clearwater deal with the Mi'kmaq on the East Coast. That allowed them to generate a great deal of capital to participate in a major project. The Métis do not have access to those sources of capital, so could not have participated in the same way. And anything that can be co-developed that would provide access to promote Métis participation in major projects would be required, and it would be very welcome. So I think there is a great deal of institutional development that needs to be done on the Métis side to provide equitable access to programming and institutions that are available to the other Indigenous peoples, but not to the Métis.
Thank you. Merci. Vous avez à peu près 25.
Thank you. Mr. Garon, you have about 25 seconds. Thank you. I'd like to return to Chief TG. What is the best solution to promote entrepreneurship? What could be done? What more could be done to help promote entrepreneurship?
I think what can be done is certainly offering some more resources and funding from the federal government to offer. Many First Nations out there do have ideas in terms of investment. We have Caroline Hilton Indigenomics raising a vast amount of funds to see more economic development in First Nations communities. Out here in British Columbia, we do have the Chiefs. I do, work with the Chiefs Committee on Economic Development. We have many ideas. And out here in BC, I do hold the chair or co-chair an initiative here in British Columbia that looks at economic development from First Nations lands. It's called the Black Books, and now we're trying to develop an institute to support First Nations. And that type of initiatives that really support entrepreneurship and allows our First Nations to think about their future, ideas about economic development. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Garon.
Mr. Garon, thank you. Now, Ms. Edwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Firstly, I will ask Stephen Morris. Welcome, Stephen Morris. I enjoyed your presentation. I told Okaluk that you would be presenting here, and she sends her regards. But I understand that we do not have the organizations and structures that you spoke of. The infrastructure needed doesn't exist in the Aboriginal communities. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected economic development in First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities? What additional supports have been put in place to address the impact of COVID-19 on economic development?
In terms of institutions and development, COVID-19 was, or the impact of COVID-19 was interesting. one thing is it affected Indigenous businesses disproportionately. If you look at the industries that Métis in particular are exposed to, if you look at some industries like finance, scientific, technical, they're about 40% less likely for Métis to be in those industries than non-Indigenous Canadians. When you look at tourism, they're far more likely to be in tourism. They're 400% more likely to be in oil and gas, mining, and those industries, the primary industries. Those are industries that remote working, you can't remotely log or you can't remotely mine. So the public restrictions hit them very hard. Tourism, in the sense for Métis, it's quite often an export industry to the United States. Those were disproportionately affected. I think I started to say that because Métis, First Nations, and Inuit don't have a great deal of equity to bring in, when they do finance a business startup, you have a higher debt to equity ratio. When you then have a program like CEBA that was delivered for the Métis through the Métis Capital Corporations, you're adding debt to a business that already had a weaker balance sheet because it had a higher debt to equity ratio. So the programming that may have been appropriate for non-Indigenous businesses was not appropriate for Métis, First Nations, and Inuit businesses. It added stress to balance sheets that were already stressed in comparison to non-Indigenous businesses. And having the same terms, they were just programs of general application, sometimes delivered through Indigenous organizations, but they did not consider the fundamental characteristics and barriers to economic development that Indigenous businesses face. So in that sense, I understand that they were done quickly, but they weren't particularly appropriate for the Indigenous population. And again, Indigenous businesses were more heavily affected because they're in industries that were more heavily affected than non-Indigenous. So the effects have been fairly severe, and the after effects are going to be severe because you now have Indigenous businesses with stressed balance sheets that will slow their opportunity to rebound from the economy, and may see higher degrees of business failure than you would in the non-Indigenous businesses. And again, the institutions that we support them with, the Métis Capital Corps and the other AFIs, are relatively recent and somewhat weak. The last point I'll make is that all of that set aside, in Ontario, where I am, 60% of Métis businesses borrowed their emergency COVID funding from the Métis institution instead of from the bank. So even though every one of them had a banking relationship, 60% turned to the Métis Voyageur to provide that. And that shows the centrality of Métis institutions in delivering programming and delivering support to Métis entrepreneurs. Thank you.
Thank you. I understand what you're saying. I wonder now, how does your department organization actively work to redress colonial barriers to economic development? I ask this question in the context of barriers such as the denial of Indigenous communities' most basic needs, such as human rights, water, sanitation, accessible childcare, health care, which affects their health and the capacity to pursue any further economic development.
Thank you. I think that all answers to economic development have to take into account the other factors that impact, as well as the fact that Indigenous people have lower levels of wealth and income. That's a fundamental impact. And a lot of those can be traced back to the root effect of colonialism and its impact upon our communities. I think that there needs to be one of the big drivers for economic development in the long term is going to be education. And there needs to be sufficient investment in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis education to help overcome the barriers to economic development. There needs to be assistance through institutions such as the one that I run, so that once people are ready to get into business, they can overcome the lack of income in our communities and still provide access to business opportunities. Again, as you say, daycare. The number of Métis women entrepreneurs is fairly high, as far as we can see, relative to the non-Indigenous population. Without access to community daycare, again, that's going to be impediment. So there does have to be a more general understanding of the impediments and the barriers. I think all of them are at their base related to the relative lack of income, lack of wealth that we find in our communities and the lack of institutions to overcome those.
Thank you very much for that, Ms. Seedlout, and that brings our round to an end. I want to thank Regional Chief TG. I apologize if I mispronounce. Is it TG or TG? I apologize if I got that wrong. And also Mr. Stephen Morse. We very much appreciate the time you took today. Sorry we had a little bit of a problem with the headsets, but we do very much appreciate your remarks as well as you answering our questions, and that will bring this panel to an end. And Madam Clerk, do we need to pause at this moment before we start the second panel?
No, we do not, Mr. Chair. We don't. The guests are in the chat. Pardon me. We could do a quick sound check with the new panelists, but otherwise we don't need much of a pause.
Okay. Well, go ahead and do those sound checks and tell me when we can start.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can you suspend the meeting?
Yes, I will suspend until you tell me we're ready to go again. To give her introductory remarks. Ms. Bull, you have 5 minutes.
Miigwech. Oni, Tabitha Indigenakas, Nipissing Indigenaba, Mijisedo Dem. Hello, my name is Tabitha Bull, and I'm a member of Nipissing First Nation. As President and CEO of Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, and all distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to provide you with my testimony and to contribute to this very important work. Speaking to you from my home office, I acknowledge the land as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. Since 1984, CCAB has been committed to the full participation of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian economy. Our work, programs, and priorities are all backed by data-driven research. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, the Indigenous economy was experiencing a period of sustained growth. Indigenous businesses made impressive gains in the areas of entrepreneurship and individual economic achievement, despite the barriers that exist. At that time, there were over 50,000 self-employed Indigenous people across Canada and over 250 Indigenous economic development corporations. The last 2 years have been a difficult time for businesses across the country, and we have seen barriers specific to Indigenous businesses more starkly than ever before. CCAB, with our partners at NACA and NIDB, undertook 3 COVID-19 Indigenous business surveys supported by Indigenous Services Canada. We found that Indigenous businesses continue to experience negative impacts due to the COVID-19 pandemic. 2/3 say the COVID-19 pandemic has negatively impacted their business operation. We acknowledge the work of the Government of Canada to introduce efforts to provide supports for businesses through the pandemic. A number of those supports required changes to ensure that Indigenous businesses were included. And while access was made available for most, we still see persistent barriers. Of the 66% of respondents who still indicate they require financial assistance, almost 2/3 did not apply for any government support. A third did not apply because they believed they would not qualify, and nearly a quarter indicated they did not know about what supports were available. An increasing number of businesses report low credit ratings or limited cash savings as a barrier to accessing government supports. Businesses also indicated obstacles such as having a payroll of less than $20,000, insufficient short-term cash flow, lack of access, and the requirement to have a CRA or business registration number. When asked what skills and training Indigenous businesses need, over half of the respondents selected support for grant and application proposal writing. CCAB has repeatedly highlighted the need for a navigator function specific to Indigenous business to assist with the understanding and uptake of the various programs. We were pleased to see a navigator position indicated in Minister Hadji's mandate letter. This will be critical as Indigenous businesses found navigating the bureaucracy, which often does not consider their unique legal and place-based circumstances, a significant barrier to accessing supports and business development programs. I use these examples of COVID programming to provide specific illustrations of barriers, but these barriers exist across government. What is lacking and what we'd like to see as a recommendation by this committee is a comprehensive federal government-wide strategy driven by Indigenous peoples to support the economy. Indigenous entrepreneurship strategy would make Indigenous prosperity a priority for every federal department, agency, and regulator, and provide the necessary down payment to support economic reconciliation. Although we acknowledge the number of important renewed commitments on accelerating reconciliation, I would be remiss if I did not express our disappointment that there is rarely mention of efforts to support the economic empowerment of Indigenous peoples for the government to signal to Canadians that Indigenous prosperity matters. The CCAB believes an Indigenous entrepreneurship strategy should include the following 3 key pillars: access to procurement and program opportunities, access to markets and supply chain networks, and access to funding. With respect to procurement, CCAB with other national Indigenous organizations, the Government of Canada's 5% procurement target, a goal first proposed in CCAB's Industry and Inclusion Report in 2019. Together, we have also provided a series of papers to the Government of Canada that outline practical solutions to increase procurement from Indigenous business. We see eliminating the barriers to federal procurement, in addition to infrastructure set-asides for Indigenous businesses and communities, as critical steps to Indigenous economic development. Through our supply chain initiative, we have seen corporate Canada's spend with Indigenous business far exceed that of federal government and continue to outgrow the pace at which federal government is moving. We are here to assist all federal partners to meet their Indigenous procurement targets. I would like to leave you with this point for consideration. Too often, Indigenous business concerns are an afterthought, resulting in Indigenous organizations like us and our friends at other national Indigenous organizations working to remedy programs and policies after the fact. We are committed to continuing to work in collaboration with the government, our members and partners to help rebuild and strengthen the path towards a healthy and prosperous Canada. Thank you all for your time. I welcome the opportunity to answer your questions. Chi miigwech.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bull, for that very concise opening remarks. And is Mr. Matatawaban, has the microphone problem been addressed? Is he ready to start?
His camera is still blacked out. I'm not sure.
No, I'm here. I'm just I'm trying to get the microphone and the speakers on the same system. Can their interpreters tell me if they hear me right now? Are you able to hear me?
Sort of, yes, sort of is one interpreter's answer.
All okay, right, well, with that, let's go ahead then.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Shannon Matatawaban. I'm the Chief Executive of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. I'm also a member of the Fort Albany First Nations of the Mushkegowuk Nation. I would like to thank you for the invitation to speak today. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm taking this call from the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. The National Aboriginal Capital Corporations is a representative organization of over 50 Aboriginal financial institutions, which provide developmental lending to hundreds of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis businesses across Canada. Aboriginal financial institutions are an incredible success story. During a 30-year program partnership with the Government of Canada, since 2014, delivering the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program, Aboriginal financial institutions, with help of modest federal subsidies, have provided over 50,000 loans totaling $3.3 billion to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis-owned businesses. Each year, Aboriginal financial institutions make over $120 million in loans to Indigenous-owned businesses. Aboriginal financial institutions have a current aggregate loan portfolio of $329 million. Indigenous businesses are a key driver of employment, wealth creation, and better socioeconomic outcomes for Indigenous communities and people. Every loan provides 3.34 jobs, life satisfaction increases by 72%, mental health is improved by 52%, and health by 19.9%. During the last election, all major parties committed themselves to undertaking the important work of walking the path to reconciliation. I'm here to suggest to you that reconciliation is not possible if Indigenous people continue to be excluded from the Canadian economy and from sharing in Canada's long history of prosperity. Indigenous nations want to end the economic exclusion and be full partners in this confederation. This is what we mean by economic reconciliation. The National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association is offering 3 recommendations that would contribute significantly to ending economic exclusion and could be important cornerstones for economic reconciliation. These recommendations build upon the already proven successful models of co-designed partnerships between Indigenous people and Canada. First, create an Indigenous housing fund and partnership with Aboriginal financial institutions. The Government of Canada's pay-as-you-go approach to funding housing and infrastructure has long been criticized. It is inefficient. It defies proper planning, has negative consequences for Indigenous communities. It is time for a more functional life cycle approach to financing housing infrastructure. Indigenous affairs ministers from both Liberal and Conservative governments have conceded that real change is needed. NACA proposes the creation of $150 million Indigenous housing funds from which Aboriginal financial institutions could leverage financing for individual and community housing. The Indigenous Housing Fund would use the proven track record of the Aboriginal financial institutions that provide Indigenous lending right now to developmental lending. The Indigenous Housing Fund would emulate the successful model of the recently created Indigenous Growth Fund, which was structured by NACA and the Business Development Bank of Canada and connects private investors to Indigenous businesses while relying on AFIs to deploy the capital based on their unique relationships with the communities we serve. Second, the additional funding for the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program announced in Budget 2021 must be made to meet the needs of the current needs and made permanent. COVID-19 pandemic has had significant impact on Indigenous communities and businesses, and these impacts have exacerbated the longstanding marginalization and economic exclusion of our people and communities. The Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program directly supports Indigenous-led businesses and help Indigenous communities generate wealth by improving access to capital and business opportunities. Third, to provide 10-year funding agreements to qualified Indigenous institutions. The Government of Canada is now providing 10-year grants to First Nation communities that meet eligibility requirements related to financial performance and governance. Both Canada and First Nations agree that there are significant benefits to these arrangements, including greater flexibility to deliver and design, greater flexibility to allocate, manage, and use funding to better accommodate local needs and changing circumstances and priorities, the ability to retain unspent funds and reduce administrative and reporting burdens. Such arrangements should also be available to Indigenous institutions that have successful track records, strong financial performance, and good governance. In the case of AFIs, this would allow for greater responsiveness to changing on-the-ground economic conditions and opportunities to allow for long-term planning that would contribute to better program management and service delivery. I would like to conclude with the following. Aboriginal financial institutions have an inevitable record supporting Indigenous businesses across Canada. We are proud of our success and 30-year partnership with the Government of Canada. Our success is a testament to the view that Indigenous organizations are best placed to design and deliver programs and services to Indigenous people. We believe that the network aligns with your stated commitment to reconciliation. Further to other witnesses' comments, I would like to reinforce that supporting Indigenous economic development and institutions in Canada will serve to align with the spirit and intent of the United Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People. More importantly, will be an investment by Canada to create a sustainable Indigenous economy and save Canada from the growing unsustainable trend in costs associated with government's responsibilities to Indigenous community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matatawaban. We'll now have a round of questions, and we'll begin with the Conservatives. Mr. Schmale, you have 6 minutes.
Chair, in an effort to keep you on your toes, I'm going to defer to Gary Vidal just for a quick second.
All right. Mr. Vidal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank you, both witnesses, to Ms. Bull and Mr. Matatawaban, for taking time to join us today. I know your opinion is valued by the committee. I'm going to ask one question first to Mr. Matatawaban. Your first recommendation, you talked about the opportunity to leverage financing for investment in infrastructure. You spoke specifically about housing, but also other infrastructure. Last week, we heard from the First Nations fiscal management folks about their concept of monetization as a methodology to leverage own source revenues into infrastructure investment to fill a very large infrastructure gap we have in First Nations communities. I'm really curious about just a little bit more of your concept of how you would utilize the leverage financing and how that would accelerate investment in infrastructure, and maybe more importantly, even to add to the end of that conversation, how it would remove barriers to Indigenous business successes in doing so.
I think it's important to realize that the capital markets have plenty of money to invest into good opportunities, and the Indigenous community is an opportunity for them to invest into providing finance while earning an interest. Indigenous communities are looking for low-cost capital to undertake infrastructure, housing, and business projects. The witnesses you heard on Friday have some great ideas on how to leverage some government backstop to attract private sector capital. Indigenous Growth Fund that we recently launched did that with the Business Development Bank of Canada, FCC, and EDC, along with the Government of Canada. We use this concept of a tiered approach to investors coming in and leaving in an evergreen model as a good model that can be utilized for around the world. We're just looking for different innovative financial mechanisms to attract public sector capital, because the government's unsustainable approach and inability to keep up with the growth of our community requires us to think differently outside the box and to co-develop different financial tools to ensure that we can do the work on the ground.
Just go to.
Thank you for that. The other quick question I would have in follow up to that is your third recommendation. You talked about kind of the more stable, longer term funding models that would allow kind of more predictability, more sustainability, the ability to look further down the road. And I think if I heard you right, you kind of used the comparison of the 10-year grant program to First Nations once they've achieved kind of the eligibility or certification requirements, which I assume the same ones that are talked about under the First Nations Fiscal Management Act kind of process that's ongoing there. Could you just expand again briefly on just so we get it really clear, we get it in the report? I'd really like to hear kind of your concept of how that applies to the AFIs as well, kind of just a little bit kind of further dive into that third point you were making, if you don't mind.
I think with the government's recent support of the United Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, in there clearly states that we need Indigenous institutions to provide programs and services to Indigenous people. I think with the government's recent approach to supporting Indigenous communities that have good financial systems in place, that have a track record, they're being recognized with 10-year grants that provides them some flexibility around delivering services on the ground. As an organization that has been delivering the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program and been delivering $3.3 billion in lending, I think we deserve the opportunity, because of our track record and our success and our systems in place, to be allocated that 10-year grant so that we can start moving towards transferring services and responsibility to Indigenous institutions and communities. And this is a good growth area for the government. With devolution and transferring services in a good and planned way. Thank you.
Just jump in.
Thank you very much. I think Gary's going to give the rest of his time to me. Let's continue down that path if we can. The conversation around the infrastructure gap and how to close it. I'm looking at some stats here that shows it could take, in some cases, upwards of 5 times longer to get a project built in Indigenous lands compared with non-Indigenous lands. You touched on it a bit, but is there anything else you care to share with us to potentially reduce some of this the time gap?
I would be afraid for Canada's planning and the present approach to supporting Indigenous communities and how long it'll take to meet the 130,000 housing units that are required in the communities, and the housing units that currently exist need renovations. The longer we wait, the more expensive it gets. In the last year, I think the last witness on Friday said expenses have gone up by 30%. So you're going to be spending more money already. As our population is growing by 4 times, the longer we wait, the more expensive it gets. It's an unsustainable system that's in place right now. What we have to do is shift our focus to creating tools that allow us to raise private sector capital, so that we're all working together on creating innovative financial solutions to solve all the problems.
Do you see?
Thank you. There's only about 5 seconds there, so I think we're going to have to. It'll be tough to get an answer in that time. So thank you, Mr. Schmale. We're going to pass on to Mr. Weiler. Mr. Weiler, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd also like to thank the witnesses for joining our committee today. And Ms. Bull, it's great to hear your testimony today after we had the pleasure of welcoming you to the Government Operations and Estimates Committee in the last government. Getting to the recommendations that you had, just particularly on the markets and supply chain, you mentioned that corporate Canada was exceeding the pace of the federal government for involvement of Indigenous-owned businesses. I'm wondering if you had any advice or learnings we might be able to take from how corporate Canada has been able to do this effectively.
Thank you. So I think we've definitely provided a few specific recommendations towards moving faster on procurement policy. I think a lot of that is about really cutting red tape, ensuring that we're able to get new Indigenous businesses into the federal supply chain. We see in corporate Canada as well that once they have a supplier, it's very easy for that procurement officer to go directly to that same supplier again. And that's no different in the federal government as well. So we need to find ways that we can bring Indigenous businesses into the federal supply chain. part of that, a good opportunity for that is to increase the sole source contract opportunity from 40,000 to 100,000, which would allow procurement officers to go directly to an Indigenous business. There's a few other that take a little bit more change, but mandatory minimum Indigenous requirement, so 5% of all contracts values over $5 million be required to be from Indigenous suppliers. This was something that was key in Australia in them being able to move forward on their commitments. And mandatory set-asides as well, between 100,000 to 200,000. In corporate Canada, we've really seen organizations who have stepped up and been very public about their commitments and also report their spend in both their annual reports and with their shareholders. So we're definitely also recommending reporting, and then the Estimates Committee is a prime example of where that could take place on a regular and public reporting of the spend of every department and organization.
Thank you for that. On your third recommendation, you identified access to funding. We didn't have really an opportunity in your opening statement to really delve into that in detail. In what form in particular, if you could just maybe highlight one or two areas where the federal government is best placed to be able to facilitate access to funding for Indigenous-owned businesses?
Thank you. I think the work that the AFI network and NACA is doing has been exceptional, but I think some of the concerns and what we saw as well from Indigenous business in the survey in not accessing some of the funding that was available through COVID in particular was the requirement for a GST or HST CRA number, specific that we a number of times. We did work with the province of Ontario on a similar restriction, and the province of Ontario did alleviate that for businesses, and the result was close to 100 Indigenous businesses who were granting programs because they didn't have that requirement.
Thank you. Well, next question I'd like to ask to Mr. Mehta Tawwabin. You mentioned in your testimony something that actually was echoed by a previous witness, and that's just some of the opportunities for devolution on pursuing economic reconciliation. And I'm wondering if the creation of an Indigenous Economic Development Agency would be one of the best paths forward to for Indigenous Service Canada's economic development programs to have devolution.
I think that's a good idea. I think there's a number of institutions that need to be created in Canada to ensure that proper planning, economies of scale, and a co-development is in place. An economic institution would definitely be one of them. An HR institution, a procurement, an infrastructure, and an organization that deals with land. I think these are all things that need to be nationally planned, nationally worked on, so that we're all supporting all communities and that there's a concise planning process in place.
Thank you. And do you see barriers at this point for Indigenous-owned businesses to be able to access the current regional development agencies that we have across Canada?
The funny thing is we brought the RDAs together in a meeting before the pandemic, and not one of them had the same services and programs. They were very unaligned. I think what we need to do is we need to include the Indigenous community and institutions into a process of bringing the RDAs back together with our Indigenous institutions so that there's alignment, there's equity of services and programs, because having it all over the place and not having one planning path is the problem of the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal governments. We all got to get on the same page, and this institution that you talked about would be part of the solution.
Thank you. And just last question here. Could you tell me a little bit more about NACA's Indigenous Women Entrepreneurship Fund and what programs are in place to support Indigenous women entrepreneurs?
So we recently launched that, and we received some money from the Government of Canada to launch this important program that is going to allow us to go from 41% in loans to 50%. It requires capacity. It requires information. It requires people on the ground. If you don't know, the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program used to be a larger program back in the 90s when it was initiated. And over the last 20 years, it's seen a reduction in services and resources. So an AFI that was able to hire 4 or 5 business development officers to line up projects that they're accessing and starting a business, they might have only 1 or 2 people in-house covering the same area. So we need to return to historical levels of funding to support the needs on the ground. And I think this can be done together in a co-design, co-developed way so that the Aboriginal financial institutions have what they need on the ground. The housing program that I talked about is filling a gap between social housing and mainstream lending. Well, there is a sweet spot in the middle of opportunity in the community of $3 to $4 billion in First Nation communities of people that are able to take out a mortgage, but nobody wants to give them one.
Thank you very much. That brings that part to a close. Monsieur Garon, vous avez 6 minutes.
Mr. Garon, you have 6 minutes. Thank you. And thank you to our witnesses for appearing today. I'll begin with a question for Mr. Mediterwaban. I'm interested in the asks being made on First Nations funding. Are some activities more prominent than others in these requests? Because it seems that some businesses have a great difficulty in accessing capital. Can you talk a bit about this, please?
Thank you very much for the question. I think access to capital continues to be a problem for all organizations and all communities. We need to work together to provide solutions to the major projects in Canada that has really stalled the economy for prosperity for all Canadians. Major Projects Coalition has projects of about 17 billion in their plan. For communities that want to participate in major projects, but they have no place to access that money. All they're looking for is lower cost capital and financial institutions that view them as a low risk as opposed to a high risk, because what we're trying to do is unlock the potential of the natural resources in the country so Indigenous communities can participate with Canada under a shared prosperity plan.
Merci.
Thank you. And I find it very interesting, the idea you put forward to have an Indigenous financing fund. Can you talk a bit more about this project? Would it be a fund that would come from federal funds and allocated to Indigenous businesses? And how would the funding go to these businesses and projects?
So an interesting thing is that we recently launched the Indigenous Growth Fund. This is a partnership with Canada, the Business Development Bank of Canada, to assist us in creating this fund. Farm Credit Canada participated in the EDC. We've already launched this. We're deploying capital to our members right now. This is going to solve some of that access to capital. We want to grow this over the long term. What I'm presenting today is to use that model and that success and the success of the model of our AFIs to deliver mortgages to the community by creating and jump-starting a new fund. And this will be specifically for mortgages. Right now, we have 2 AFIs, ABSCAN in Quebec, and we also had ANTCO in BC, who between the both of them delivered $30 million in mortgages. So they issue bonds and they raise capital. What we're trying to do is put this on steroids for all of Canada to access that percentage of the communities that are looking for mortgages. They have a full-time job, but they're not given a fair shake by lenders that are afraid of the Indian Act and providing assets on a reserve. Well, this is going to meet that needs. There's other communities in Canada providing mortgages on reserves, and this would jumpstart that. There's an opportunity at $3 to $4 billion. So I think if the government of Canada participates, gets that snowball rolling, it'll grow as we access the mortgages, raise more capital on the markets. It's a good model, and I think we should put that in your report for sure.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you. And Ms. Bull, you talked about the impediments with respect to Indigenous businesses. We know everything's been complicated by the pandemic, but 2/3 of businesses have problems with financing. What about the geographic component? How great a role does it play? And how does it affect Indigenous communities, remote Indigenous communities?
Thank you. I think firstly, the geographic component, definitely businesses were impacted based on the lockdowns in wherever they tended to live. And definitely in some communities, community-owned businesses where communities had actually stopped off their border from people coming and going. So we definitely saw, particularly Six Nations, saw a significant loss with their businesses where they would normally have people coming into the community to purchase businesses. But this was also a key area because it is typically on reserve businesses that do not have a CRA business registration number. So definitely those privately owned businesses on a reserve were unable to access a significant amount of that funding. And then we also see from a finance perspective is more rural or remote businesses don't have a traditional lending bank branch there, or they don't have a specific branch that they work with. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, we saw a lot of those branches actually shut down. We actually saw a lot of cash flow issues, specifically in remote communities, where there just wasn't cash in the machines for people to get money out to be able to purchase from businesses, because that was a restriction at the very beginning of COVID as well. So we definitely see that from a financial perspective, that it does impact geographically.
Thank you. Mr. Mitato-Abani, you have about 20 seconds if you also wanted to respond.
Well, I think what's important to understand is with any sort of access to capital, you have enabling programs that support the deployment of that capital. What we need is innovative programs that support the movement of capital to the community. In this case, we're trying to develop the entrepreneurs in communities, which requires business development officers to support each and every entrepreneur with pre-business support services, capacity programs, just getting them excited to start a business. Same thing with mortgages. Everybody's used to social housing. We got to move them to an understanding that having equity in a home is very valuable, creating generational wealth. That takes time, that takes capacity and development and the right enablers to ensure that we can deliver these programs.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, on va passer.
Thank you very much. We will now go to Ms.
Thank you. I will ask Shannon. I was pleased when you said at the beginning of your presentation that you had started an Indigenous Housing Fund. I will ask you about, I'd like to know more about your proposal regarding the development of the Indigenous Housing Fund. What stage are they at in getting the fund established? And if you can tell us what supports they need to ensure its success. We have to support this. Thank you.
Of our members that have been delivering a housing program within their regions. They've delivered $30 million through their own efforts to raise capital within their regions. What we want to do is utilize the NACA network. And we have 50 financial institutions from coast to coast to coast, utilize their 35 years of experience of providing business loans, assessing business loans, having the administration and the infrastructure in place to start delivering mortgages. And with mortgages, they would be able to support those community, the market within the community that is able to handle a mortgage payment. Now we've done some work, and $3 to $4 billion in mortgages is available, but we need the government to support the development of this program. Like I used an analogy of a snowball. If we started with a certain amount of money to get it going, and we deployed that money, we take those mortgages we put them together, and then we raise more money on the market, and so it just continually grows. But the bigger part is to repair the housing system and the approach, or the thinking and the mentality in the community of the social housing lens. We got to introduce everybody to the concept of owning a house, of taking care of a house and building up equity into their house. There's a capacity program that's required to build that market up, to work with that market, because it's not something that'll happen overnight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Question was, I'm quite interested in the presentation that you had about the Indigenous Housing Fund, and I'm wondering what stage you're at with it and what you see needs to happen to ensure its success.
I would really like the committee to put that into their report. We're going to be presenting that concept to Director General's table that is looking at the same issues. We're going to present it to Indigenous Services Canada. The more support we have for it, the more likely it's going to happen. But your feedback is very much important. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Second question to Tabitha Bull. You mentioned barriers and support systems. You mentioned 3 items: access. How would you kickstart those? How would you move those forward? If more people will take advantage of this tool, how would you promote it to ensure that more people are using the system?
Thank you. So first on procurement, we have been, as I said, working quite closely with the government on pushing for the 5% and every ministry and organization to meet the 5%. Within CCAB, we have a program called Supply Change, which has a procurement marketplace and close to 1,000 with Corporate Canada. And that's enabling them to be able to get the expertise to respond to bids, to build their capacity. But definitely, we need to ensure that we're building capacity within Indigenous businesses to be able to work with federal government. So that's one key area. We also need policy changes within the government in order for us to ensure that Indigenous businesses have access. Within our procurement marketplace, we do share government, but we've been working with other national Indigenous organizations to understand how best we can bring together all of the Indigenous businesses that we support and ensure that they have connections to the federal government as well. From a program development perspective, we continue to push for every ministry and organization within the federal government to look at their programming and ensure that there aren't barriers for Indigenous businesses to respond, to ensure that they're communicating specifically to Indigenous businesses, and we're of course here to help with that, and to have set-asides within those programming dollars. So I said to have set-asides within their programming dollars for Ministry of Agriculture to have set-asides to ensure that Indigenous businesses have a niche within those programming dollars to be able to apply. And when we look at infrastructure, we saw this, we've seen this before in other provinces and other governments. Infrastructure that's being built in communities needs to ensure that there is a community business that's part of that project, or a community as an equity project. And I think there's a to incent corporates and to incent equity partnerships in ensuring that any procurement response or RFP, specifically with infrastructure, has an Indigenous community or Indigenous business as part of that project.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much both Ms. Bull and Mr. Mtatawabin for their insights today, for their opinions about barriers to economic development, and also for some of their recommendations. We very much appreciate this as a committee. Thank you for taking the time to come and speak with us today. Much appreciated. Madam Clerk, I'd like to suspend at this point so that we can reconvene as as a committee to look at the work plan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.